Hi everyone, I'm Sreyas Venkataraman. I'm a risk scholar from the 2024 cohort. I spent the past summer working with Professor David Held and Professor Zachary Erickson as part of the RPAD and the RCHI lab. I was mentored by Yu who's a PhD student at RICAU. So my project is on automatic reward generation for unlabeled trajectories. This is going to be the structure of the video. I will go through the overview and motivation, and then move on to the problem setting and the background. Then discuss the methodology that we developed, and then show you some experiments and results, and conclude. One of the key algorithms and setups used in building autonomous agents is reinforcement learning. To give you an overview, let us assume that we have a particular agent which we want to learn a particular task. So in the paradigm of reinforcement learning, we essentially run the policy, that is, we allow the agent to interact with the environment from which we collect samples. Now, based on the samples and a reward function, which models our task or our end goal, we fit a model. Using this model or the return, we try to improve the policy of the agent. And once this is done, we leave the agent back in the environment to collect more data. While the appeal of reinforcement learning is very clear, there are a bunch of bottlenecks which it faces which limits its application. The first bottleneck is that collecting and generating samples is costly and infeasible in many scenarios, especially in complex real-world environments. This is because the agent, while exploring the environment, is prone to put itself in unsafe states and thus can lead to harm of the environment, of people in the environment, or the agent itself. And second is that it is often costly to deploy the agent in such a real-world scenario. Uh, Learning is often too slow. Reward functions are hard to engineer for complex tasks. Since we have now looked at the bottlenecks, it is very clear that reinforcement learning in an online setting in the real world environment is a very costly, unsafe affair. So, a very clear alternative to this is that we can either have a deterministic policy or an analytic policy or a teleoperated policy using which we can collect data from the real world in a very safe, controlled fashion and then use that log data to essentially learn policies. This paradigm is referred to as offline RL. So in this paradigm, we have only access to a fixed data set, and we want to learn high quality policies from that limited training distribution. The last bottleneck that I mentioned in the previous slide was with regard to engineering reward functions. We want to engineer reward functions that are representative of the task and the goals we want to achieve. But this is a time consuming and highly iterative process. Can we replace it by maybe using some learning based methods? Prior work exists on using either inverse reinforcement learning or foundation models to do the same. But most of these works require access to low-level ground truth information. It's very hard to obtain, or they have a high variance in the reward that they give you, and the reward is too noisy. Now, given this overall overview and motivation, let us move on to the problem setting that I deal with in my project. So in this work, we consider an offline dataset of unlabeled trajectories generated from an underlying Markov decision process. We restrict ourselves to an entirely offline setup, so the agent cannot query the environment or expert for additional data. One key uh, One key difference in this problem setting is that the dataset can be suboptimal. That is, we do not have a requirement for the dataset to be generated by an expert demonstrator. Existing work which addresses this kind of problem statement or problem setting typically make one other key assumption. They assume that the data is generated by an expert. Let us look at two classes of work which solve this kind of problem. One is behavioral cloning, where the goal is to mimic expert demonstrations. Behavioral cloning learns a policy to map states to actions, and it is sort of like supervised learning, where either a negative log likelihood loss or a mean square error loss is used, and the agent essentially just learns to map states directly to actions. But just directly mapping states to actions have severe drawbacks. One of the very apparent problems with behavioral cloning is the problem of distribution shift. So say during test time at a particular state or a particular time step, the agent takes an action or is displaced due to the stochasticity of the environment. Then it is put in an unfamiliar position and it continues to take bad actions, and at the end of it ends up in an entirely different end goal or end state. This problem is known as covariance shift or distribution shift, and behavioral cloning is prone to this. And this very reason limits its application in real environments and complex environments. The other branch of work which deal with solving a similar problem statement is inverse reinforcement learning. So inverse reinforcement learning learns a reward function that can be utilized to train the policy for task completion. But traditional IRL methods typically derive a cost or a reward function for which the data set of expert demonstrations that they hold is optimal. So their reward function essentially is derived in a fashion where the data set itself is the optimal solution to it. So in the case where the data set is not optimal, inverse reinforcement learning does not tend to work really well. And it also has issues with the computational efficiency of the algorithm. Then can we now learn rewards which don't optimize for the data set, which have low variance and which don't require a lot of non-truth information? It turns out that we can, using foundation models such as VLMs, just by using a task description and a pairwise comparison of images. So we incorporate these two assumptions into our problem setting. So our modified problem setting now essentially adds three additional constraints. One is that we assume access to visual observations of the states, and two is that we know the task that we want to learn as a textual description. The third assumption is that we can infer the task progress from the visual observation. Now, given our modified problem setting, let us look at how our method solves the issue. So our method is divided into two phases. One is a reward learning phase. So where we have a data set of unlabeled trajectories, we sample pairwise, we sample pairs of observations, which are images, and then we feed it along with the task description to a vision language model such as Gemini or GPT-4. We ask the vision language model to give us a preference label, and then we use this newly generated pair and preference label to essentially learn the reward model. So how do we do this? We essentially use preference-based reinforcement learning for learning the reward model here. So what the equation that you see here is called the Bradley-Terry model, which essentially gives you a notion of probability given a parameterized version of the reward. So we assume that the reward is parameterized by a neural network, and then we compare for the pairwise states that we've given. We compute the value of this probability, and then based on the preference label, we backprop through the network. And essentially, this allows us to learn a reward model just from preferences. To query the VLM from our experiments, we found that a two-stage template works out best. So initially, while giving it the sample observation pair and the task description, we explicitly ask it to describe what is shown in the image and ask it to compare between the goal states. And then we cache this response and feed it back to the VLM, asking it to now reply with a preference label that is either 0 or 1 based on which observation achieved the goal better. And in case the VLM is unable to distinguish, we discard that particular pair. From our reward learning phase, we have now obtained a engineered and learned reward model. Now what we do is that we take the unlabeled data set that we had before, which consisted of unlabeled trajectories, and now we use the reward model to essentially label each and every transition. And then we use this newly labeled data set to essentially learn a policy using offline reinforcement learning. While offline reinforcement learning is prone to a bunch of other issues, we use implicit Q-Learning, which is one of the go-to algorithms which essentially mitigates or tackles to a certain extent all of the problems mentioned here. Let us now look at some key experiments and results. So the environments and data sets we consider for this work, we essentially consider a wide variety of data distributions and three environments. So cart pole is a classical control environment where the goal is to balance a pole on a moving cart. Here we use a replay dataset. A replay dataset is essentially a dataset which is a subset of the replay buffer of a model trained online from start to convergence. Then the second environment that we consider is an environment which is part of the meta world benchmark. So we consider the drawer open environment where the goal of the robot is to pull out a drawer. And in this environment, we consider two quality of data sets. We consider a data set generated or consisting of completely expert transitions. And then we also test out our method on a random data set. And then the last environment that we consider is a deformable task. It's a deformable environment, which is rope flatten, where the goal is to straighten a rope from a random configuration. Here are some demos of our algorithm performing. So as you can see, the rope is initially in like a very tangled configuration, and our algorithm does pretty well. Same for opening the drawer. Let's now take a look at the results or the reward curves. So we see that the blue line on top that you see here is the policy or the eval score from the ground truth reward, which is hand engineered by humans, and the red line that you see is the behavioral cloning algorithm. And you see the green line is our method, and it performs pretty close to the ground truth reward even on a random data set. Similarly, here also the blue line is the ground truth reward, and we see that our our method, which is based on VLM feedback, performs comparably. Another ablation or study that we wanted to do was to verify that the reward we are learning is in some sense similar or representative of the ground truth reward, and thus is representative of the task itself. So what we do here is that through an entire training run, uh, we've just plotted the batch reward, and this was done using the same seed. And as you can see from both these graphs, the reward that we've learned through preferences is actually pretty similar to the ground truth reward. The only difference here is scale. While we have mainly evaluated in simulation environments, the end goal or the larger motivation behind the project is to at the end of the day deploy it in real world complex scenarios. So one scenario we thought would be nice to test out on, or would be a nice verification, is robot assisted dressing. So we had a bunch of trajectories, a bunch of videos in which we had a robot attempting to dress a human, and we here ran an ablation study of various VLMs and various prompts to see whether it is still able to identify task progress correctly. So the goal here is to essentially dress or verify whether the person is being dressed by the robot. Moving on to conclusion, future work. We present a method for utilizing unlabeled trajectories for learning tasks. If we have access to a textual description of the task and access to visual observations, we demonstrate that our proposed method's effectiveness on rigid and deformable object manipulation over varied data distributions. This is a novel contribution of our work, and we could extend this work by implementing it in real-world scenarios and complex environments such as dressing. And we could also extend it to evaluate its performance in log horizons of tasks. Thank you. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank every member of the RIS 2024 cohort and the community. I'd also like to thank the members of RPAD and RCHI for their support, and especially Mr. Especially Professor John Dolan and Ms. Rachel Burchin for their support throughout the summer. Thank you.